An Ominous Element, an original post-apocalyptic story, read by the author. This story follows directly after the events of The Bridge and Whispers and Storms, and those should be listened to first. Those two can be found in the playlist linked below, along with all the narrations also set within the same universe in the order that they occur. "You seem stressed," Spino said to Nick that night. They were lying side by side in Nick's backyard, looking up at the stars. Nick sighed, turned his head to the side to face Spino. "Yeah, I am. People complaining about this, people complaining about that. There's a problem here, there's a problem there, and I have 2 missing scouts. I think you need to relax." "I can help with that," Spino said. "What?" Nick asked as Spino grabbed him. "Hey!" Spino smirked and remembered the ticklish place on Nick's side he had discovered one night back when he was a baby. Spino lifted his hand and began to lightly rub one of his large claws at the end of his fingers over the spot. "Don't you dare stop, Nick said, beginning to laugh. "You know I'm ticklish there." "Exactly," Spino replied. "You need to laugh more. It does good things for your mood. So, I say you're going to laugh whether you like it or not." Nick tried pushing the dinosaur's hand away, but it was no good. "Come on, Spino, please. I just want to relax, not be assaulted," he said, laughing. "Oh, fine. Another time, then," Spino relented, allowing Nick to sit himself back up. Nick sighed and took a few deep breaths. "The big, vicious Spinosaurus," he mumbled. "More like a laughing-stockosaurus." "Would you rather I be one that wasn't special?" Spino teased, lying his head back down on the grass. "I wouldn't have you any other way," Nick replied, as the back door to his house burst open and a red-faced Susan stepped out. "Nick, inside!" she said furiously. "What's the warden want?" Spino asked. Nick elbowed the dinosaur's nose and stood up. "Oh, shush, this is going to be enjoyable enough without your commentary," he muttered unhappily. "I'm just trying to offer moral support, Professor Sarcasm," Spino called as Nick opened the door and went inside. "Me? Sarcastic? I think you have that backwards," Nick added, shutting the door. Spino laughed again once Nick closed the door, and yawned before lying his head down, ready to catch up on the sleep he missed the night before while watching over Mabel during the storm. Susan sat at the kitchen table, arms crossed, glaring. She looked angry enough to scare away a fully grown Tyrannosaurus Rex. A lantern that sat on the table illuminated the room and her scowl. Nick entered the kitchen and steadied himself. He knew this was going to be bad. "Yes, dear?" Nick gently asked as he sat down across from her. "You want to know what Mabel just told me?" Susan asked. More of a statement and not a request. "What did she say?" Nick tentatively replied, not sure what his wife was getting at. "Mabel told me where she was with your dinosaur yesterday. How he kept her safe during the weather. You want to know what that meat-eater's safe place was?" Sure," Nick shrugged. "Does yesterday matter? She's home and safe." "In his mouth. He kept our daughter in his mouth for the whole damn night!" Susan shouted. "Mabel says it was the only way she could be kept out of the rain. That is some bullshit if I ever heard it. That stupid carnivore had her inside of his mouth for the whole damn night." "Really? This is what you're upset about? She came home just fine. Does it really matter what his method of protection was?" Nick asked. Sometimes he tended to be forgetful that Susan didn't know Spino as well as he did, nor had she ever learned to fully trust him, despite having known for years. "That's what you have to say? Of course it matters! She could have been eaten. He could have eaten our daughter. He's a dinosaur. He eats meat." Susan just couldn't understand why Nick wasn't the slightest bit concerned, and she was beginning to shake from anger, which only increased as she saw Nick's lack of concern. Okay, I get what you mean. I really do. But listen, while I can't say hearing that has left me thrilled, I trust Spino, because even though he is a carnivore, I know that he would never hurt our daughter. He loves her as much as we do, and it sounds to me like he was doing his best to keep her out of the rain. Hell, some crocodiles do the same thing with their hatchlings. It was thought by some that Spinosaurus did the same thing, and if it ever came down to it, I'd trust Spino the same way Mabel did, Nick said. You know, I raised Spino from an egg. I know him better than anyone else. So, I think you're overreacting just a tiny bit. He said it was better to stay where they were, though he didn't exactly tell me what he meant by that. Now I get why. But would you have preferred that he just made her sit out in the rain? I've spent nights in the forest in that exact type of weather, and it's awful. At least she had some shelter. They were in the middle of nowhere. He told me that much this morning after getting home. It sounded like it was the safest thing for her in the moment, Nick answered, his voice rising but still calm. After that, the family drama concluded with Nick getting kicked out of his own house and told that he could sleep outside with his favorite dinosaur. Not wanting to antagonize his wife further, Nick sighed and elected to just let her have her way. He felt that it would be better for everyone if he just let tempers cool down, so he walked away and headed over to Spino, who had fallen asleep. Nick leaned against Spino's head, and the dinosaur's red eye opened and gazed at his friend. Did the warden sentence you to a night in the elements? She completely flipped out on both of us. Both? Spino asked. Yeah. Mabel decided to come down from her room to try to help my case. I think she just made it worse. So, I'm gonna be the bigger man and just let Susan have her way tonight and try to make peace tomorrow. Nick looked at Spino and continued. Personally, I think you did the best you could have yesterday. Spino nodded slowly. Thanks. How'd Mabel take it when you suggested your idea to keep her out of the rain? Better than your wife, Spino replied. Well, that's easy to believe. I've never seen Susan so mad. But I get it. I mean, generally what ends up in a carnivore's mouth does end up as food. She knows you're different, deep down. At least I think she knows. But I also think she doesn't really know you. Not like I do. Once protective Mama Bear wears off, she'll come to her senses. Till then, you're sharing the yard with me? I think giving her some space would be wise, Nick smiled, leaning against the side of Spino's head and closing his eyes. I'm sure it will get better. I hope, Spino replied. And if it helps, Mabel slept like a baby last night. Well, good, but I don't have any desire to sleep in the same place, Nick replied, making them both laugh. Once they quieted down, Nick patted Spino's nose. Good night, Nick said, enjoying the cool night air. One night sleeping under the stars would not be so bad, he thought to himself. The next morning, Spino and Nick both woke at the same time, and when Nick found the back door still locked, he decided to spend his time doing a morning inspection of the guard stations along the community walls. He was halfway up the street from his house, rubbing his eyes, when he noticed something near the main gate. One of the missing scouts was back. No longer half asleep, he picked up his pace and ran to the gate. The scout was shouting frantically, and when he saw Nick, he wrestled free from the guards restraining him and threw himself in Nick's face. Voices! 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 We heard voices! He said, looking around with a crazed look in his eyes. The guards hurried over and continued their unsuccessful efforts to try to calm the man down. Nick grabbed his shoulder and shook him lightly, looking him in the eyes. Whoa, 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 buddy. Calm down. Tell us what happened, Nick replied in a calming manner. The trees, they started talking. Voices from everywhere. Voices in the leaves. They sting and talk and kill. Who? What? Nick asked. trees, mate. The trees. The scout replied in a slightly calmer voice, though the crazed gleam in his eyes remained. Nick continued looking the scout in the eye and slowly stepped back. Get him some food and water and a place to rest, where the doctors can keep an eye on him. He then looked at the scout again. We'll talk soon, yeah? People bringing trade goods from one of the nearby communities, Arnold's community, had disturbing news when they arrived. Hunters from their community were hearing the same phenomena about voices in the trees with no sign of anything speaking anywhere. The traders arrived sickly, saying that they felt sick after they'd been stung, and they'd then found darts on their bodies while riding back along the trade route. And despite it being several hours since the scout returned to the community, he was still only muttering nonsense about the trees and the sting. That was all anyone was able to get out of him for the entire day. And as the day went on, all the traders from Arnold's community who were hit by the darts grew sicker and sicker after only a matter of hours. That afternoon, Nick was in the infirmary, checking in on some of the more critical cases. Shortly after he arrived, many of the ill began to spit up and choke on blood, screaming in pain while holding their stomachs. Everyone hit started simply feeling like they had the flu, but after a few hours they were screaming in pain. The result was that they died after vomiting up huge quantities of their own blood. As this began happening, some took more heed of the words from the first scout, and people began to fear the woods. It became clear that something more cryptic than dinosaurs was lurking about. Not a single witness to the strange occurrences had seen anything. All they could report was that they'd heard voices in the trees. Just voices. They never heard or saw who or what was speaking. Mabel was out of the house and running down the street before Susan could stop her. After kicking Nick out, she put her daughter back to bed, where Mabel had stubbornly stayed all day. After she awoke, Susan had told her that she could never go near Spino again. Overprotective, and now authoritarian, Mama Bear was still out of hibernation, and it made Mabel furious. They had another argument later in the day, and it ended when Mabel ran away from the house. Leaving the front door swinging behind her, Mabel ran down the street and out of the sight of her mother. Mabel had a plan, though. She turned and cut through a neighbor's backyard and ran back to her own. She ran up to Spino, who was jarred from his nap and startled by her sudden appearance. "Hide me!" Mabel said as she caught her breath. "What? Where would I do that?" Spino asked, still groggy. Mabel groaned and dove behind his back leg. "I'm not here!" Spino sighed, shaking his head to clear the last dredges of sleep from it. "You need to have a talk with your mother, not hide behind my ankle." Mabel just sat against the back of his leg and didn't speak. Spino sighed again and decided to just let her pout for a while. He knew from experience with Nick that heightened emotions never helped solve a tense family dispute. It was best to just let everyone have their space for a while where they could cool off. Then everyone could have a calm discussion. His argument with his wife was no longer on his mind when Nick entered the front door of his house. He was so focused that he didn't even see Susan sitting in the kitchen. He was thinking about the deaths of those who'd arrived with trade goods that morning. They had all died by the late afternoon after being stung by the mysterious darts. "What are you doing here?" Susan asked as Nick walked into the kitchen. He only gave her a sideways glance. "I came to get my gun," he said, walking into their bedroom. He emerged a moment later, strapping a holster onto his belt. His silver pistol reflected the late afternoon sunlight. His tone made Susan pause, and once Nick had his pistol fastened to his belt, he walked towards her. The fight was over as far as he was concerned. "You need to listen," he said as he entered the kitchen. "No, Nick, I don't," Susan shot back. Nick sighed and grabbed his wife by the shoulders. He gently pressed her down to keep her seated, and then sat down next to her. Listen, you can leave this house if you want, or you can stay. You can stay pissed at me for as long as you want. You can shout and scream at me, but you cannot leave the community, Nick firmly said. Oh, and who says so? Susan growled. In fact, I think taking Mabel with me to one of the other towns will do some good. Get her away from you and that dinosaur. You're not taking my daughter from me. Now, turn off the angry mama bear for 1 second and listen. You can't enter the woods. Nick's voice was rising in frustration. Listen, he added, speaking quieter. I say again, leave the house if you want, but you, Mabel, and our unborn baby are not going into those woods. Calmly, he explained everything that had occurred that day to Susan. After a few minutes of silence, Susan asked if they needed any help in the infirmary. She was a part-time nurse for the community and often studied old medical textbooks in her downtime. Although poisons and toxins had not been a subject which she'd spent much time studying, it certainly sounded as if there was a strong possibility that was what had killed the traitors. No, everyone stung by the darts is dead. I'm guessing that's why our other scout never came back. Where's Mabel? Nick replied. Susan explained what had occurred earlier that day. She'd been so steamed in anger, focused on only one issue, that until this moment, she didn't grasp the possible severity of Mabel running out of the house. Okay, don't panic, Nick said. I'll find her. She couldn't have left the community. The only way out is through the gate. There's no way that she could have gotten out with all the extra guards I put in place. He stood up and hurried to the back door, unlocking it and going outside. He had a feeling he knew where she was hiding. Like father, like daughter. To be continued. An Ominous Element, an original post-apocalyptic story from the Spinosaurus, read by the author. This concludes the last narration that will follow this plotline. To see how all of this continues and what happens next, be sure to stick around and watch for the release of the published version of the Spinosaurus, coming soon. Wave 3 of narrations is not over, even though videos about these specific characters are. The next installment of this wave is coming in January. In the meantime, be sure to give the other narrations a listen, and also check out the video of me talking about the setting and the characters, and all my videos about the books are linked below. The playlist specifically dedicated to the audiobook material has them in chronological order to help out with listening to them. Thanks for listening. He was so focused that he didn't even see He didn't see Soothen.